Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, we're going to create a Halloween-inspired piece based on the Japanese technique of Boro stitching. Now, Boro stitching is a Japanese process of making patchwork and then mending. The purpose is to salvage materials, usually clothing, but it can be blankets and such. And they add additional patches, patchwork essentially, as we call it, over their design, their original fabrics, and then they stitch, and this creates layers. And these layers make the fabric more sturdy, more warm and snuggly, and it salvages and reclaims the beauty of the original piece. We're going to do something inspired on this process today using Halloween fabric. I'm going to create a block using Halloween squares or different colors of fabric, different patterns that I have, and then I'm going to stitch over all of them. It's kind of like laminating the fabric with straight stitches. And from there we'll have a final piece. Now the beauty in this is all of the layers and all of the repetition of the stitches. It's a very soothing project to do because the stitches are very basic and very calm. Now usually they use one color thread to create the piece, but here I'm going to take a little liberty and use various Halloween colors as well. And I use lots of whites to brighten it up. So let's get started. This is a fun project to use because I get to use up all of my fabric scraps, particularly the Halloween themed, but it can obviously be for any theme. Now what I do is I take the base, the page that I want to work on, and here I have a quilt that I've cut up and I've been using it for years now, and it has this edge which I really think is fascinating. So I want to take advantage of that. I also, because I don't really like this print for this particular use, I just have a neutral piece of fabric that I cut down so it covers the majority of the background, and this will still fit into my book quite nicely. And that's why I just happen to use this size. But use whatever size that you want. If you want to just make a tiny little square because you're feeling creative, go ahead and do that. You don't have to have a certain size. I have my colors. These are just traditional Halloween colors because that happens to be my theme. The majority of my Halloween fabrics have some form of orange, white, and black, and then it's got a few other colors. So that's why I use these colors. And by only having a few, that restriction really makes it very easy to start to put together. So I just go through my scraps, and as you can see, I just have a bunch of different fabrics here. Some are just fall themed, and some are clearly Halloween themed. And now what I want to do is basically piece together a square on this background. Now it doesn't have to be a perfect square. If you're somebody that likes precision, go ahead and make that a nice perfect square with good angles. But what I want to do is piece together a square. So to start with, I'll just take a fabric marker and just make a very light sketch of the square that I want to make. And this just gives me a little bit of a boundary. And so now I want to fit my scrap pieces within that square. And I like them to all be different sizes and shapes. So I'll start with this nice dark fabric here, and I'll cut this to size and work that inside my square. This will just be one edge. And then I'll do that with the remaining fabrics, playing around with getting a nice shape here. And it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be something interesting. I always start by looking at some of these bigger fabrics, these bigger prints, something that I like, and then basing it around that. But that's the beauty of this project. It's very forgiving, and you get to be really creative. You use what you have. So here I've created just a square. Sometimes the fabric overlaps, sometimes I tucked it behind. I'm really pleased with the way that came out. It just kind of happened along that way. So now I just want to pin this down very lightly. So now, once I'm confident that my pins are holding my fabric in place, more or less, I'm just going to take a single thread of embroidery floss. You can just use regular sewing thread if you want. I have a knot on the end. So now I'm just going to stitch around just to base this down so that I can remove the pins for the next step. So I'll make just a few stitches everywhere that that fabric intersects to hold it down in position. The stitches really aren't that noticeable. I chose a color of thread that kind of matches the majority of the fabric with this orange, but all I'm doing is just trying to hold my fabric in place. You can use a glue stick, and if you're secure with that, then go right ahead and skip this step. So now, as you can see, I have these large basting stitches, and they're good enough that it will hold my fabric in place so I can remove the stitches to start the next part of this project. Now I'll just show you on the back. It's not the prettiest stitching, and they're large stitches. Basting stitches were designed so that they'll hold the fabric in place, and then you could easily cut them to remove them. There's not a lot of tension there. We can either remove them afterwards or just leave them in place. It's not a big problem either way. They don't really tend to show. So now I just want to start my Boro stitching, and basically I want to laminate the entire piece with stitches. And so this is time consuming, but it produces a very interesting result. It gives a whole nother layer of texture to the piece. So what I like to do is have multiple colors. Typically the Boro stitching just uses one color, but you don't have to. And that's where it starts to become personal and very intriguing. So again, I took the colors from my theme here. So I have two oranges, a black and a white. And I just want to accent it with the oranges and the black because that'll really make it pop. And the white will help lighten up the finished piece. So I'll start with my black since that's the darkest color. And now I have a knot on the end of my thread. And this is 6 strands of embroidery floss, but you can use whatever amount you want. The 6 strands will give it a lot of texture, and that's the look I'm going for. So I'm going to start here, just the bottom of this main panel here, and I'm just going to make straight stitches, and I can make them small or large. I'm going to make them about maybe 1/4 of an inch, and I'm just going to make an entire column of them. So I'll just go down, can even make a running stitch where I'm pulling through the fabric. I just have a lot of fabric here, so the running stitch kind of fights me, so I don't mind making the straight stitch. It takes a little more time, but it's very interesting, the result. So I'll make this column, and my goal here is to not only tack down our little decorative fabric, but it starts to really pull the fabric underneath it when we have multiple of these stitches, and it gives a very interesting effect. So I'm just going to come down to the end of the fabric, just the base, and now I want to make a block. So I'm going to come up on another row here, and I'll continue to do that, and I'll do that maybe this much of my fabric. I can determine if I want to use just what's on my needle or if I want to continue to add. So what I tend to do is make 3 groups of 3s of these little blocks of my stitches. I like the 3 just because it's an odd number, but you don't have to do that. I'm not looking to make my piece symmetrical, just balanced. So I'll stitch this entire block and show you what I mean. So I've stitched that block, and as you can see, I've made the stitches parallel to each other, and it's starting to come alive. I'm going to add another block here and another one over here. I just wanted to show you the back of it. You can see how it's making a little rectangle here with all my stitches. So I'll make those other blocks and show you how they look. So here I have my 3 blocks of black stitches, and it's starting to come alive here. It's starting to laminate the piece. If you look closely, you can see how it kind of pulls the fabric, so it adds another texture. Now the back is very simple. You can just see my blocks. So now I'm going to take advantage of the stitches that I started, and I'm going to choose a different color here, and I'll go with the deeper orange. And I'm going to continue adding blocks of these colors. I'll add the darker orange, and then I'll add the lighter orange. After I have those blocks done, I'll fill in any of the area that remains on this piece with the white thread, and that will just lighten it up a little. So I'll continue stitching and show you how it looks when all the blocks are complete. So I've continued to stitch all the way around in different blocks of color. Now my stitches don't line up exactly, but they do kind of line up all in columns. So I would suggest either making them line up in columns or rows if you don't want to do both. I just like that effect. The interesting part is that this piece is now kind of laminated with stitches, and it feels completely different. It's very firm. It's kind of a very interesting effect. This technique is designed to reinforce clothing when you want to repair it by adding patches and then adding stitches, and it makes the piece very strong. I just love the look from all these stitches, and by adding the themed fabric, it kind of makes it a little bit festive. Now I want to show you the back. The back is kind of beautiful in itself. To see all the different stitches and the knots and however it ended up. So that's how I use Halloween themed fabric to make this little Boro design. So that's how I create a very intricate patchwork Halloween design based on the Boro Japanese stitching. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks for joining me today.